This episode of the podcast is being sponsored by a friend of the podcast in honor of all the guests who come onto the show and kindly share their wisdom and knowledge with the listeners. As always, if anyone wants to support the show or to sponsor an episode, please email me, svarmchatter@gmail.com, or in the show's notes and on the website, there is a link through PayPal to give. And again, as I asked before last episode, so I'll mention it again, I'm looking to upgrade the audio quality, so through various some equipment, some services. So if anyone is interested in helping out with that, again, the same thing, email me, svarmchatter@gmail.com, if interested in helping in any amount is appreciated with that. Or again, on the website or on the show's notes, there'll be a link through PayPal. I could go that way. And also, I did mention last episode again, and I'll just reiterate again, if anyone can rate and review the podcast on Apple is very much appreciated, and same thing on Spotify. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarm Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Aviva Ben-Or, who is a professor in the Department of Judaic and Near Eastern Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And we'll be discussing her newest book, which is Jewish Autonomy in a Slave Society, Suriname in the Atlantic World, 1651 to 1825. And she's written other books in Suriname, so we'll be discussing Suriname and its Jewish community. So thank you, Professor Ben-Or, for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation.
Okay, so let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Of course. I am by training a historian, and I began my studies as an American Jewish historian, well, actually as a medievalist, who then became an American Jewish historian. And of late, I've entered what we call Atlantic history, the field of Atlantic history, which looks at the interaction of the four continents of North America, South America, Europe, and Africa. So that's where my most recent work is heading in that direction.
Okay, so Suriname, before we get to where it is and its overall history, just one more question about that. So how did you get specifically interested in Suriname to write this lengthy study and some other books in Suriname?
My involvement with Suriname was complete happenstance. In the late 1990s, as I was finishing up my dissertation on an American Jewish Sephardic community, a young architect from New York approached me at an academic conference, and she was looking for a translator to accompany her to the rainforests of Suriname and to document the remnants of colonial Jewish cemeteries. And at that time, I didn't have job prospects. I thought, why not? It was a very good summer project. So I joined her, and we documented one cemetery and then another Jewish cemetery, and then an Afro-Creole cemetery. So this is a cemetery of enslaved people and their freeborn descendants. And that ended up being a partnership. And I ended up writing my first two books on Suriname with that architect, who is Rachel Frankel.
Fascinating. Okay, perhaps we can discuss those books later. So let's start off. Let's discuss Suriname. I'm sure listeners listening, where is Suriname? So just a general history of where it is, the country's history, and as a Dutch colony, its overall, again, so its overall history and where it is geographically.
Suriname is a Dutch republic in South America, or was a Dutch republic until its independence in 1975. And it was first settled by indigenous migrants from the Caribbean islands. When the Europeans arrived in 1650, they made it into first an English colony beginning in 1650 or 1651, and then the Dutch took over in 1667. So from 1651, it became a very diverse population of indigenous people, Europeans, and then the enslaved Africans that they brought over from West Africa.
Okay, so obviously the book is about Jewish autonomy, as we said, the title, so it's about the Jewish community. So when did the Jewish community start in Suriname?
Jews were among the earliest European colonists. They came over probably starting in the 1650s. By 1661, we already have concrete evidence that they had formed a Jewish community. And these Jews were of Iberian origin. Their ancestors had been Jews forcibly converted to Christianity, and they had lived as Christians and actually intermingled with the indigenous Christian population in the Iberian Peninsula for centuries. So by the time they came to Suriname in the 1650s, many of them had dual ancestry themselves, that is, indigenous Christian, going all the way back to the Middle Ages, and also Jewish ancestry, starting from the forced conversion in Portugal in 1497, the conversion of Jews to Christianity.
Right. So these are for listeners, these are part of the Spanish Portuguese communities, they'd be called, right? The former Morano, Converso, New Christians, as crypto Jews, whatever terminology, people are familiar with. And these were kind of, to use the word, headquartered like in Amsterdam, they were in Hamburg, in London, and that part. So, but mainly this community was part of that, right? At this time, we don't have Ashkenazi Jews in Suriname.
Ashkenazi Jews, Jews of Central and Eastern European origin, they started to arrive in Suriname in large numbers by the late 17th century. But the majority of the Jewish community in Suriname was of Iberian origin. And they spoke mainly Portuguese, although they also knew Spanish. And you're correct also to mention that they did not come directly from the Iberian Peninsula. They came via, as you called it, their headquarters in Amsterdam and to a lesser extent in London. So there was never direct migration from the Iberian Peninsula. And this is very much an Atlantic story. The way to explain the meeting of these population groups, the only frame of reference to make sense of this is Atlantic history. You have the interaction of these four continents, Europe, Africa, North and South America.
Right. Now they end up in Suriname. So something interesting is why Suriname? I mean, why specifically do the Jews end up not there? They obviously go to other parts of the Atlantic, but why Suriname?
Well, during this time period in the mid 17th century, Western Europe had only recently reopened to Jews. So by the late 15th century, legally speaking, there were no Jews left in the region, the Atlantic coast of Europe. And only starting in 1590 were Jews permitted by the local authorities to re-enter. And in 1590, the first Jews came to Amsterdam after centuries of no Jewish community. And there, of course, was overcrowding because not only were Jews fleeing persecution from Eastern Europe coming to Western Europe, but there were also Iberians who were fleeing inquisitorial persecution and came to lands under Protestant rule where that persecution did not exist. Many of them embraced formally Judaism, and the local Jewish population augmented very quickly. So there was a situation of dire poverty and overcrowdedness. And the leaders of the communities, the Jewish communities of London and Amsterdam, were seeking new places for settlement. So they turned their eyes first to Dutch Brazil, which a Jewish community that fell in 1654, along with the Dutch colony when the Portuguese took over. And after the fall of Dutch Brazil, they looked to the northern coast of South America, including Suriname. The important point here is that most of the New World was Catholic, so Jews were legally not allowed to settle there, but they were allowed to settle in Protestant-ruled lands, including Suriname and including, for a small time, the Dutch colony of Essequibo in what is today Guyana.
Right, and you mentioned Brazil. That was where I think Recife. So the first rabbi, I think, was there, Biscavo da Fonseca. I think Moshe Rafael de Aguilar also perhaps went with him. So and then they had to run back to Amsterdam, as you said, when it fell back to the Spanish. So in Suriname, where did the Jews live? Where were they headquartered? Where were they living? Were they headquartered? Were they one main city, or were they spread out throughout the country?
In the first decades of European colonization, Europeans chose mostly to settle downriver rather than on the coastline. And Jews did that as well. So they settled about 30 miles south of the capital city of Paramaribo, which is still today the capital of Suriname. Actually, the first capital was Torarica, but that's a little marginal point. And they settled in that downriver region, 30 miles south of what is today called Paramaribo. And that is where they developed their first Jewish community along a river called the Casipora River. we know about that community because the Jews were able to establish their first cemetery. This is one of the cemeteries that I documented with my co-author, Rachel Frankel. The earliest grave dates to 1666. But within about a decade or so, they settled 1.5 miles downriver to Yoden Savannah. And that opened a totally new chapter in the history of Surinamese Jewry, because it was an area that allowed them to create something like a Jewish metropolis, a village where only Jews lived, ostensibly, and where they had an unparalleled degree of communal autonomy.
Yeah, and that's something that we're going to get into, the communal autonomy. So could you just clarify one thing? You said that you kept saying they went downriver. Was that has to do with the geography of Suriname? What do you mean that they were everyone was settling downriver?
Well, first of all, the country is 90%, was and is 90% or over rainforest. So to navigate the country, you had to use the rivers. In order to establish plantations, and the economy of colonial Suriname was based on tropical agricultural plantation economy, you had to have these vast expanses of land that were suitable for an agricultural environment. So this is what I mean by downriver.
Got it. Now that was something. Before we get back to the communal autonomy, we should probably mention generally also another thing is the economy. You mentioned the economy by plantation agriculture. Do you mean mainly sugar? I know sugar was a big crop at this time and a very labor intensive thing as well. You want to talk about that and explain that to the listeners. But was that something that mainly was doing there and that they were using the enslaved population for?
Sorry, I'm going to have to pause now. Sugar was the leading tropical agricultural product, followed closely by other tropical products like coffee and cacao, cocoa. And the hopes of the early colonists in Suriname was to turn Suriname into a second Brazil. So after the second Brazil, the colonists hoped, we too can set up sugar plantations that will enrich the colony. And that will make Suriname not only a second Brazil, but also a second Barbados, because Barbados, an English colony, had also begun as, or eventually transformed into a sugar colony. But the people there transformed the environment by chopping down virtually all the trees, so that the sugar economy was in danger of collapsing. There were no trees to fuel the sugar kettles to process the sugar. Now, Suriname being largely rainforest provided many trees. So there were many hopes that Suriname could actually be a sort of a resurrected sugar economy after the failure of Dutch Brazil and after the environmental destruction in Barbados.
Now, sugar was a labor-intensive production, I guess, and so this led to them needing a lot of slaves. Explain to listeners, the Jews were involved in this as well, and they owned plantations as well, I assume in Suriname, correct?
That's right. So, well, one myth about Surinamese Jewry is that they were extremely wealthy. This is not true. The majority of the society was indigent. Of course, it's very difficult to define what poverty means. But one way to gauge that is by looking at how many people were receiving charity and how many people were actually plantation owners. And a very small elite of Surinamese Jewry did own plantations, but they owned many acres of plantations, and the revenue was very great, so great that the elite became very wealthy and was able to support the majority indigent Jewish community. And of course, plantation agriculture was, as you said, very labor intensive and required dozens and in some cases hundreds of workers. In the early days of colonization, Jews worked on these plantations. They carried out the labor themselves, sometimes side by side with enslaved Africans. But over time, the majority of the workers became workers of sub-Saharan African descent, and they were unfree, of course, and their unfreedom transferred automatically to their children in the case of enslaved mothers.
Now, you mentioned before the community of Suriname. So what does it mean, the community? What kind of, there's autonomy, like I said, mentioned already a few times, your book title is Jewish Autonomy in a Slave Society. So they had this kind of autonomy. So what do you mean by that?
Well, community it's a very good question to ask what a community meant. And to have a community, you need not only a group of people to self-identify as a community, but also an outside force to recognize them legally as a community. So in the case of Suriname, you had both. This was a community that was politically organized. They had bylaws. They had sacred ground of a cemetery. They had land upon which to build a synagogue. And they had an elite literate class to keep records through the centuries and to negotiate with the local government, the local colonial government, for privileges. And the local government was in a situation where it needed to attract white settlers to the colony. They needed white settlers because not too many Christians from the Netherlands or from the United Provinces were very keen on immigrating, because the economy was doing quite well in the Dutch Republic, and most Christians had no reason to leave. Jews, on the other hand, had many reasons to leave, not the least of which was poverty and overcrowdedness. They also were barred from many of the trades and professions of the Dutch Republic. So it was easier to convince them to come. And the colonial government created all sorts of perks for the Jews. And it's really important to see that these perks were not simply bestowed upon the Jews. These were perks, privileges that the Jews campaigned for very aggressively. And the perks were unparalleled in Jewish communities at that time. Some of them were quite usual. For example, the privilege of practicing Judaism openly and freely, the privilege of having a synagogue and sacred ground for a cemetery. But others were not common and were probably unparalleled. For example, the privilege of owning their own village. It was a piece of land downriver that was communally owned by the entire Jewish community. And the plots of land could only be occupied by Jews of Iberian origin. Non-Jews could not own land there. Even Ashkenazi Jews could not own land there, and they could only live there by special privilege of the Portuguese Jewish community. Jews also had their own tribunal, so they could live according to their own laws, civil and religious, and they had their own schools, and they could continue their own languages, and their language was principally Portuguese, but as I mentioned before, they also knew Spanish, and the very educated among them also knew Hebrew and Aramaic, although that was much rarer.
Now, how was this community structured? A lot of other listeners may be familiar. We've discussed this in the past. A lot of the especially the Spanish Portuguese communities, they had a mamad. There was like a governing board, and there was various organizations involved in the community. How was this community structured? Was it similar to those?
Right. So you mentioned the word ma'amad or mahamad, as it's pronounced in Portuguese, Hebrew. And this was a governing council of laymen, lay Jewish men. They were not rabbis. Most of them didn't even know Hebrew or Aramaic. And they governed with an iron fist. So the privileges that Jews negotiated for successfully with the colonial authorities mandated that all Jews had to adhere to Jewish law. All Jews who entered Suriname were automatically part of the Jewish community. They had to pay their dues and they had to follow the Jewish laws. And if not, the Jewish authorities, these laymen, were authorized to expel the Jews either from the local community or the colony at large, of course, with the help of the governing officials. So that was quite unusual, this coercive force that Jewish laymen enjoyed to control the Jewish behavior of their constituents. And these Jews were governed by bylaws. They were known in Portuguese Hebrew as escamot or ascamot, And the number of these bylaws increased through time. They numbered over 100 ultimately, and they were translated from Portuguese to Dutch, so that the government, the Christian government, was very aware of what the laws were and how Jews had to behave. What's fascinating about these bylaws is that they increased over time, again, because of the negotiating power of the Jewish community. And I'll give you just one example of this. There was a slave auction held by the local Christian merchants, and it was held on a Jewish holiday. So that, of course, meant that Jews could not participate in the purchase of slaves for their plantations. So these Jews protested to the government, to the colonial government, and they were able to change the rule so that the auction would not be held on a Jewish holiday, and Jews could also participate.
Now, you mentioned those bylaws. I know in other Atlantic regions, communities, a lot of the records are gone and do not survive or not extant today. How are the records? This gets to the question of, you mentioned here, the sources that you use. We can discuss more of that later, but just basically these records, these bylaws, do they survive today?
And this is a really important question. So before the podcast began, we spoke about the recent book of my colleague Stanley Mervis, who wrote a book on 18th century Jamaican Jewry. And his challenge was much more daunting because almost all of the records were destroyed in fire and in other circumstances. So he based his book mostly on wills. My situation was much more envious, I think, because the sheer amount of material left behind in multiple languages enables a historian not only to write a history of Surinamese Jewry, but many histories. And after me, there will come other scholars who will write other histories probably totally different than the one I wrote. But the nature of the sources, I based it mostly on communal archives, which are these daily records kept by the lay leaders, the Portuguese Jews who left behind these almost daily records, mostly in Portuguese. Sometime in the 1830s, they transitioned to the Dutch language. And it's a wonderful view, not only of the Jewish community, but of the colony at large. So you can write about the Jewish community, but also the context, the broader context with its multi-ethnic population. I also used wills, as did Professor Mervis, and I used Dutch colonial records. They had their own bylaws, of course. The governors kept journals, for example. And I used letters as well, not to mention the physical remnants that I studied with my colleague, Rachel Frankel, that is the cemeteries and the remnants of the synagogues.
Yeah, and we'll discuss the synagogues in a little bit. So let's discuss a little bit more about Yodin Savannah, if I'm pronouncing it properly. So this village, as you were saying, this is kind of something unique to Suriname versus other places. So, I mean, what was the population at its height? What was the population like in the village? Were they old plantation owners? But what were you mentioned before? There's a few elites. So what did everyone else do? What were they doing? And I mean, how was the village structured, laid out, and those kind of questions?
Sure, yes. So there were attempts before Yodin Savannah to create Jewish villages and also Jewish neighborhoods. Those attempts had occurred to some extent in the English colony of what is today Guyana, and Sequibo, and also in Cayenne, which was a French colony. But those colonies were very short-lived. They lasted maybe a decade and a half. And in Brazil, until 1654, there was no one Jewish neighborhood. There were maybe 3 synagogues, in fact. So in Suriname, we really have the first expression of an all-out Jewish village. This is a plot of land which is perhaps 150 acres, if memory serves from the map. So it's relatively small, much smaller than the large sugar and cocoa plantations, for example. But it's large enough upon which to build houses and a synagogue and a school. They had a yeshiva actually there in Suriname called Etz Chaim. I just wrote an article about this for an edited volume, in fact. And the mikvah, there were mikvaot in private homes, but Jews also used the Suriname River ostensibly for the purification of their women and their dishes. And the idea that this was a Jewish village should give us pause, because the majority of Suriname's population was not white, it was not Jewish, it was not white, it was African. So upwards of 90% of the population was of sub-Saharan descent and also enslaved. So if you could go back into time and gaze at this village, you would see a settlement built on a hill, right? That is in consonance with the Talmudic dictum that a Jewish community has to be built on a hill so that the synagogue will be an elevated place. And of course, you would see Jews, mostly speaking Portuguese, but the majority of the population would have been enslaved people of sub-Saharan origin who were serving, who were laboring, and who were serving. They may have been domestic servants. They may have been also plantation laborers. And this is very, very important to remember, I think, because the entire economy was based on slave labor. Jews were there because slaves were there.
Now, you mentioned earlier that in the village, only Sephardim, Iberian, people of Iberian descent were allowed to own land. So, were there Ashkenazim there though, and if not, where did the Ashkenazim live? Because there was an Ashkenazi community in Suriname as well.
Right, and I should mention that Jews were proliferated throughout the provinces of Suriname. They lived in more than half of the provinces of Suriname. So we shouldn't imagine that Jews only lived in Jordan Savannah. That simply isn't true. They had a community, a parallel community in Paramaribo, Portuguese Jews I'm speaking about. And when Ashkenazi Jews arrived beginning in the 17th century, they initially joined the Portuguese community. That is, they worshipped side by side with them, and they had their own cemetery directly adjacent to the Portuguese cemetery in Paramaribo, but they were not allowed to settle in Jordan Savannah. Now and then you do read about an Ashkenazi Jew living in Jordan Savannah, but they did that by special license. And now and then you hear about an Ashkenazi Jew who dies in a slave uprising in the region of Jordan Savannah. And we can assume that this person too was there by special license. But Jews, in fact, were proliferated through more than half of the districts of Suriname, and that tells us something very important about their privileges. Unlike in many parts of Europe, they were not limited to a certain residential area. And we should see this as indeed a privilege. They could decide to settle where they wanted. But of course, it made sense for them to settle near to a Jewish community, especially since by law they were mandated to behave Jewishly, to live a Jewish life. In the 1730s, the Ashkenazi community formally withdraws from the Portuguese Jewish community in Paramaribo. And the Portuguese Jewish community bequeaths to the Ashkenazim their synagogue. So Ashkenazim take over the synagogue, but they are mandated to maintain the minhag of the Portuguese Jews. So imagine this. These are Ashkenazi Jews who have to pray in Hebrew with a Portuguese Hebrew accent. It must have been quite a battle. And over the years, actually, you see Ashkenazi pronunciation of Hebrew seeping into the Portuguese Jewish community as well. You can see that in the very names of the congregations. So, for example, the first congregation of Suriname was called Beracha v'Salom. That's the Portuguese Hebrew pronunciation of what today in modern Israeli Hebrew, we would say Beracha v'Shalom. So you can see that the S is an SH in modern Israeli Hebrew, and Tzedek v'Shalom becomes Tzedek, because it's a Tzaddik, becomes Tzedek v'Shalom. So Tzedek v'Salom becomes Tzedek v'Shalom. And this pronunciation seeps into Portuguese Jewish pronunciation. And at a certain point, the historian realizes these were not hermetically sealed communities that were always apart. There was intermarriage throughout the generations. And another myth that I tried to address in my book is that intramarriage between Ashkenazi and Portuguese Jews was forbidden. That's not true at all. It was discouraged, but you did not lose your membership in a Jewish community. Your allegiance might legally transfer to the other community. And the status of your children within the Jewish community might change their allegiance to either the Portuguese or Ashkenazi community, but you were never expelled from the Jewish community. And you see something parallel, of course, in London and Amsterdam. So that's a huge myth. These intramarriages were never banned by the Jewish community, but they were at times discouraged.
Okay, so when we mentioned a bunch of time the synagogues, we should talk about them, the shuls in Paramaribo and in Yodin Savan and the other ones. And especially, I think one of the ones in Paramaribo, right, is the distinct with the sandy floor, with the floor. So till today, for those that aren't familiar, you can talk about that. But just in general, talk about the various various shuls in Suriname.
Sure. So there was the only rural synagogue that we know of in Suriname was the one of Yodin Savannah. There was probably one that did not survive that was in the riverine community of Kasipora that I mentioned before, but nobody knows where that is. There are some descriptions that generally tell you where it was, but the remnants have not survived or have not been discovered. So when we talk about the rural synagogue, it is the Berachav Salom synagogue of inland Suriname adjacent to the rainforest. In the capital city, there was initially the Portuguese synagogue of Sedek Visalom, and then the Ashkenazi synagogue that was taken over by the Ashkenazim, Neve Salom, so oasis of peace. Sedek Vishalom meaning justice and peace, and Neve Salom meaning the oasis of peace. So in Paramaribo, then you had these two synagogues, one Portuguese, one Ashkenazi. But then in the mid-18th century, another congregation arose, and it's not exactly correct to call it a congregation because it was more like a communal organization, a prayer group. And this was a collectivity of Eurafrican Jews. These were bona fide Jews who were acknowledged as Jewish by the community at large and by its lay leaders and by its rabbinical leaders as well. Their ancestry was, however, a little more innovative. They traced their maternal lineage to sub-Saharan Africa. They were typically the children of enslaved mothers, and their fathers typically were white Portuguese Jewish men, and eventually also Ashkenazi Jewish men. And in the 18th century, mid-18th century, they received permission from the organized Jewish community, the Portuguese community, to found their own prayer group. And this congregation, they definitely came to see themselves as a congregation, even though legally they were not. They called themselves Darchei Yesarim, which is the Portuguese Hebrew pronunciation for the path of the righteous. So in modern day Hebrew, we would say Darchei Yesharim. And they were legally allowed to convene. The reasons they gave for founding their own prayer group was because they lacked dignity when they tried to pray in the organized Portuguese congregation or the Ashkenazi congregation. And they wanted to recoup the spiritual satisfaction and the dignity that they lost in a mixed setting, where as people of African descent, they were marginalized. They had to sit on the mourner's bench, the avelim, the mourner's bench with a U. And if they were female, they had to sit in the back of the balcony. And they also did not get any of the privileges during ritual. For example, men could not be called for an aliyah to read from the Torah. And they found this very humiliating. In their own words, they used the word lack of dignity. So they received permission from the Portuguese Jewish leaders to achieve this prayer book, and it existed for many decades with no problem. In the late 18th century, as the late Robert Cohen shows, though, they hit upon a problem when they started to protest their marginalized experience and their second-class status. This was in the age of revolutions where people of African descent were rebelling all across the Atlantic world, and especially in the Caribbean and North America. And they decided to campaign for a status equal to the status of white Jews. And they got involved, they got the involvement of the local colonial authorities, the governor, and also the metropolitan authorities, the authorities in the Dutch Republic. And it became a huge cause célèbre, a very expensive litigation. As an attorney in training yourself, you will probably understand how costly this must have been. And they ended up losing the battle. The government decided that the laws of the land had to stay in place, and the laws in the land were the bylaws of the Portuguese Jewish community, which decided that there were first-class Jews who were considered white, and there were second-class Jews who were to be of known slave ancestry and known sub-Saharan African ancestry. So although they lost their battle and they had to pay very expensive legal fees thereafter, and they were put on a payment plan, they had to pay it off over the course of many, many years. As I argue in my book, they won the war. So they lost the battle, but they won the war because the late 18th century was a time of rebellion among people of African descent, slave origin, and even people who are still in chains themselves, who are clamoring for equality, for parity, and also for dignity. So very gradually, you see the Jewish community formally repealing the discriminatory laws that mandated Jews of African ancestry had to sit on the mourner's bench, or had to sit in the back of the balcony, or had to be buried in the margins of the cemetery. All of those laws were gradually repealed until official parity, official equality between all Jews.
Now, I do want to get more into those Eurafrican Jews of Suriname, really fascinating. But just one more thing about the synagogue. So Neve Shalom or Neve Salom was the one, that's the one with the sand, with the floor of sand?
Yeah, so to our knowledge, all of these synagogues had sand on the floor. And this has been another myth that I tackle in my book. If not in my book, then perhaps in an article that I wrote, because it's a little tangential, but there's a myth that Jews of Portuguese ancestry covered the synagogue floor with sand as a memory of their inquisitorial persecution, their lives as Marranos, to use that colloquial term, their experience of trying to maintain a secret Jewish life out of earshot of the Inquisition. And therefore, they tried to muffle the footsteps of the worshippers of the synagogue by sprinkling the floor with sand. This is a myth. It was invented in the mid-20th century, probably by a person called Isaac Emmanuel, who was a Jew serving as the spiritual leader of the Portuguese Jewish community of Curaçao, and he also became the official Jewish historian of the community. And I found a letter written by him where he was asked about the sand, and he came up with this theory. Well, it was probably a remembrance of the time when Christians of Jewish ancestry were trying to maintain their Jewish identity and trying to muffle their footsteps in the synagogue. But this came from his brain. It was his fantasy. And it's fascinating how myths become an understood fact. And now people everywhere from within the field and without point to this legacy of inquisitorial persecution, and they connect it to the sand. But in fact, sand is utilitarian. And a scholar called Barry Stiefel has written about this too. He has a book on the historic synagogues of Europe and the Americas. I think it's called Jewish Sanctuary, perhaps in the Atlantic world. I'm forgetting the exact title. And he does a very nice job of showing that sand was utilitarian. It was a way to keep mud out. And sand was used not only in synagogues of the Caribbean, but also synagogues in the old country, in the metropole, and not only in synagogues, but also in churches, and not only in churches, but also in bars. So it was a very cheap way to maintain hygiene in public places.
Okay, it's just an interesting thing. I mean, this can still be seen today, I think. And you mentioned Curaçao, which also was which still is a Dutch colony. The synagogue also had the sand on the floor.
Yes, it still has the sand, and I think that the important part of the maintenance of the sand, there is something Jewish about it. That it stayed, the sand stayed when all the churches and the pubs changed their flooring and took the sand away. The sand in the Jewish synagogue remained. And I think that is a Jewish thing, because Jewish communities tend to maintain archaisms. In this case, it's an architectural feature, which is archaic. But if you look at Jewish languages, many Jewish languages maintain the medieval vernacular. For example, there are certain dialects, Jewish Arabic dialects of North Africa, that when you study them, you realize this is the Arabic that was spoken by the medieval or by the early modern Muslim community of, let's say, the 16th century. And Muslims no longer use this type of Moroccan Arabic, but Jews do in their dialect. So I think you can understand the sand as an archaism that survived from general culture.
Okay, so let's go back to the Eurafrican Jews, as they're called. I mean, there are other terms that are used for them, so you can mention why you choose to use the word Eurafrican and not others. You already described their fight in the community, so I don't know if we don't have to cover that again, but just about them, and generally, I guess we can talk about them in the wider Atlantic a little bit. Listeners may not be familiar with these Jews, so how they came to be and how many there were and all that.
So percentage was a very important question in my book. I wanted to know in a population where upwards of 90% of the people are of sub-Saharan descent, and where slavery is legal, and where Jews are considered white, they are legally classified as white, and hence they're permitted to own property. Property includes owning human beings. Is it really possible to maintain a community of Iberian Jewish origin that does not have any braided history in their ancestry? And my conclusion was definitely not. So I started to look at marriage contracts, and I found 4 marriage contracts. So these are eight individuals who were married in the Jewish community of Suriname in the 1720s and 30s. And all of them, these marriage contracts are in Hebrew and Aramaic. They are virtually identical to the traditional ketubot that you would have today if you are an observant Jew. And there's just one little feature that makes these ketubot unusual. The brides and grooms are called mishuchrarim. And a mishuchreret means a manumitted person, a person released from slavery. And these ketubot are fascinating because it shows that rabbinical culture in Suriname resisted racialization. They didn't call them shorim. And tombstones, by the way, do. The tombstones do refer to ha'avadim achsarim shorim, the cruel, uprising blacks. But these marriage contracts do not. They mention manumitted people, which is a legal classification. It simply means somebody born into unfreedom, somebody born a slave who was manumitted and now is a person equal to freeborn people, with one exception: they must marry a fellow manumitted person. So they cannot marry a freeborn person. And even though I only found these 4 marriage contracts that were unions between Eurafrican Jews, I also did some genealogical study, and I carried out some statistical analysis, and I found out that by the early 19th century, almost every Jew in Suriname had some sub-Saharan African ancestry, however remote. The reason for this is because it has to do with sexual exploitation. So in any slavery system, and the Talmud talks about this too, the theory of the Talmud talks about what is a slave. A slave is a person whose labor is owned by the master or the mistress, but also their body is owned by the master or the mistress. So therefore, in a situation of sexual exploitation, there is no rape. A master may have sex, and usually did have sex, with his female slave, and she did not have any say in it, theoretically and probably also practically speaking. So today we would call this rape. I think it's much more complex than that in historical context. And I think we also cannot discount the idea that women could have used the sexual relationship as a way to raise their social status and that of their children. And I think that is one ingredient of what is happening when the sources speak about enslaved African women wanting to bring their children up in Judaism and loving the religion. And you do hear this from the sources written by Portuguese Jews. I think there is some truth to it. And speaking about that does not mitigate the fact that this was a situation of exploitation and very narrow choices for women of an enslaved status. The other thing I want to say is that the Jewish bylaws, the askamot, they had a clause for whitening. It was a whitening clause. And in the Jewish community, they didn't talk about white and black or mulatto Jews so much as they did congregantes and yechidim. Yechidim is the Portuguese Hebrew word. Today in modern Hebrew, we would say yachid, yechidim, yachid. They said yachid, yechidim. And these were individuals who were full members of the Jewish community by virtue of their publicly agreed upon white identity. And they could sit anywhere in the synagogue they wanted, in the balcony or in on the floor of the synagogue. They could be buried in the central locations of the cemetery. By contrast, congregante, which is a Portuguese word meaning congregant, these were second-class Jews, and their second-class status derived from the fact that either they or their mothers were slaves and of African ancestry. But the Jewish bylaws, they had a whitening clause by which if you were a congregant, if you were a second-class Jew, if your children and your grandchildren married white Jews, so married Yechidim, they could recoup the original Yechid status of the white Jewish family. So basically, if your grandchildren married white Jews, the family could once again be considered, or the grandchildren at least could be once again considered white and Yechidim, and could enjoy all of the first-class privileges that legally considered white Jews enjoyed. So this clause also makes you realize, well, there are people walking around who are reputedly white and their status is Yechidim, but in fact, they are probably very conscious that they have African origin, grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, et cetera, et cetera. So to conclude, this is a factor of sexual exploitation, unfreedom in slavery, and also the fact that the majority number of the residents of Suriname were enslaved and of sub-Saharan descent.
Now, this ksuba that you mentioned, one of them is reprinted in a full facsimile on page 137 in the book, I think, it's 139. So for those interested in seeing it, it's in the book, it's there, you can actually read it, it's a very nice, nice handwriting.
And I also want to, I didn't mean to imply that I found these ketubot. There are generations of scholars who preserved these documents and also annotated them. And one of the fascinating things about these ketubot is that somebody in pencil wrote, I'm trying to remember what the handwriting was. It might have been something like Black Jew or something like that. And which is wrong. They were not Black Jews. That's the whole point of these rabbinical documents. They were meshuchrarim, which is something totally different in that context. So I didn't discover them, of course not. I came upon them, and I just want to really express my gratitude for the generations of scholars and archivists who so carefully preserved these documents and commented on them through the generations, people both in the colonies and in the metropole in the Netherlands.
Now, these Eurafrican Jews, just to emphasize this, were very often converted, right, to Judaism. They were Magayer. Did they go right? Was that the case?
Indeed. So there was a mechanism for conversion, and we have prayer books that Portuguese Jews used that actually include a conversion ceremony for a slave. It says, this is the prayer that you shall recite upon bringing a slave into Judaism. And this is the same prayer that was used, Bisman Beit HaMikdash, when the Second Temple still existed. So we do know there was a mechanism for conversion. It was a rabbinical mechanism for the conversion specifically of slaves to Judaism. And by the way, a similar prayer, I found a similar prayer in Curaçao, in a prayer book in Curaçao about 15 years ago. So it was used there too. But I think most of the Jews who, certainly by the late 18th century and early 19th century, most of the Jews who could claim sub-Saharan descent were born Jews by that time. their mothers were Jews, even if they were born into slavery. They were halachically Jews, and they were bona fide Jews as considered by the Jewish community of the time.
One last thing on them, I don't think you just mentioned this before, which that you call them Eurafrican Jews. People may have come across Creole and other sources or other terminology. Why do you pick the term Eurafrican? What does that mean?
So the term Eurafrican is not my invention by any means. It is a scholarly term used to describe the intermediaries who were African born on the west coast of Africa, who were born in European colonies, and who acted as intermediaries. They were often multilingual, and they could speak Dutch and English. And they often had white fathers and indigenous African mothers. And so that is the scholarly term, Eurafricans on Africa's western coast. But I use the word Eurafrican and apply it to the Surinamese situation because I really hesitated to use the word Black and mulatto and all the other gradations of African descent for many reasons. First of all, for a person who spent most of my life in North America, these terms, they do have a tinge of lack of dignity and racism, which I didn't want to replicate. But also the terms are quite meaningless for the situation of Suriname. Black, what did really Black mean? And what did mulatto mean? And many individuals, they could be called Black in their childhood. And once they hit adolescence, their categorization would change and they would become mulattoes or quadroons. So I found the terms not very precise. They just were uncomfortable to my ears. In addition to that, and I wanted something more neutral that simply gestured to the fact that these people had their origins, their ancestral origins in both Europe and in Africa, even though most had never set foot in either of those continents. I thought that this was the best way to describe them. It was the most accurate way. And it avoided a lot of the confusion that the terms bring to the table, as well as let's face it, the lack of dignity and the history of racism that most modern people in North America attach to the terms Black and mulatto and quadroon.
Okay, so chapter 6 in the book is really very interesting, and I'm sure a lot of listeners will enjoy hearing about it. Is something that I believe is termed Purim in Suriname. So obviously listeners are very familiar with Purim, but Purim, it's not a Purim in the public eye, but it's really Purim in Suriname, a little bit in the Atlantic. You discuss generally Atlantic and the Caribbean, but talk a little bit about this chapter where you discuss Purim in Suriname.
So yeah. Oh, and by the way, just tangentially, the word Purim is a really good example of how Ashkenazi pronunciation infiltrated into the Portuguese Jewish pronunciation of Hebrew. Portuguese Jews would have called it Purim. The emphasis falls on the last syllable, right? It's milra versus milel. But anyway, we say Purim in Ashkenazi pronunciation. So I first came across the subject of Purim because I kept finding allusions to enslaved people who had the name Purim. And I said, what is this? Certainly a number of slaves had Hebrew names, but a slave named after a Jewish holiday, this is something that I really should look into. And I found that throughout the Caribbean, you could find enslaved people owned by Jews named Purim, and they were always male, and they were typically of African birth as opposed to dual Eurafrican descent. I then found out that the Jewish community was kind of obsessed with this holiday. It was the most important holiday for them, more important than Yom Kippur, certainly more important than Chanukah, which only becomes a very important holiday to Caribbean Jewry after the late 19th century, more important than Rosh Hashanah. Even though in most places of the diaspora, Purim is celebrated for 1 or 2 days, starting with a fast followed by a day of festivity. In Suriname and in other parts of the Dutch and English Caribbean, Purim was celebrated for up to 2 weeks. Not only that, but basically the entire colony shut down in order to celebrate this holiday. It was not just Jews involved in the celebration. It was not just the enslaved people that they owned. It was also the free people of Christian faith who were taking part in this holiday. And on the island of Curacao, by the 19th century, it was accompanied by fireworks. And in Suriname, there was a great ruckus where people became inebriated and they were dancing, and free people were dragging along enslaved people in wagons through the streets. So it was a holiday of reversal, very public expression of this Jewish holiday. So I tried to find out why this was, and I was very interested in the colonial government's reaction. They were quite upset. The colonial government was quite upset by the ruckus. The Jewish lay leaders were also very upset, and they continually tried to curb in the celebration of this holiday by outlawing masquerade, by outlawing public celebration by adults and limiting it to children, for example. But what I found just through inference is that Purim became a shared holiday among Jews and people of African descent, and probably drew on an Afro-Creole tradition of carnival. So that is a holiday, a celebration that occurs around this time, February through April, sometime from February through April, a celebration that involved inebriation, public festivity, dancing, and masquerade, and that drew on African heritage, but also on Jewish heritage. And in my chapter, Purim in the Public Eye, I argue that Purim, as celebrated in Suriname, and by extension in other parts of the Dutch and English Caribbean, by the 19th century had become a shared Jewish and African holiday, and more specifically, an Afro-Creole holiday. This again speaks to the fact that the majority of the population of the colony was of African descent. So as I argue in my book, when you study anyone in that community, in the colony of Suriname, you have to center Africa and the descendants of Africa.
One other thing that you discuss in the chapter is also that there were slaves actually named Purim.
That's right. And as I mentioned before, they were males. There was one that I was following closely who seemed to understand the meaning of his name. He understood what the Jewish holiday of Purim was about, that it was about the near genocide of the entire Jewish people of ancient Persia, and the overturn of this planned genocide as almost carried out by a high official, Persian official. This overturn of genocide by a couple of Jewish heroes, Mordechai and Esther. He understood this because he kept rebelling, and this is in the 1770s and 1780s. He kept rebelling. Small and large acts of rebellion, such as stealing a goat and slaughtering it, or threatening his Jewish mistress, threatening white Jews. His rebellions coincided with the holiday of Purim, and sometimes with Yom Kippur. And this is actually true in general of the enslaved population of Suriname. Those who were owned by Jews lived to the rhythms of Jewish holidays. They knew when Jewish holidays were happening. They took part in Jewish holidays as servers, as people helping free Jews celebrate these holidays. And they understood the religious meaning behind these holidays. So if you just do a little bit of work, if you look at the dates in the bylaws are often given in the Christian date, like February 3rd or whatever. If you just do a little calendrical work and translate it to the Hebrew date, you will find that many of these outbreaks of violence among slaves coincide with Jewish holidays, especially Purim.
So, as you mentioned a number of times, but 90% of the community in Suriname was enslaved people or people of Black people. But at the height especially, what was the percentage of Jews, including these Eurafrican Jews, but what was the percentage of Jews in Suriname?
Yes, you did ask me that previously, so I should get back to that. when we're talking about Atlantic Jewish communities, so Jews of the Americas, we're talking about, from our perspective, very small numbers. So the Jews of the Americas by the late 18th century numbered maybe 5,300 people total. It seems so insignificant. But you have to understand that at a time where most places in the Americas were shut off to Jewish residency, these are really astounding numbers. And the communities that they developed were very important. They were offshoots of very dense communities in Amsterdam, especially, which numbered 23,000 by the late 18th century, but also of London. And these were interconnected communities. So you can't look at these communities in isolation. 5,300 individuals doesn't really tell you much. You have to look at the whole Atlantic region, and you have to look at the fact that Jews are migrating, Jews and others, they're migrating, they're in constant circulation, and they're attached to communities that are much larger in number and in some ways more politically powerful abroad, where the centers of metropolitan power lie. And what I argue in my book is it's not so much numbers as percentage. So if upwards of 90% of Surinamese population is of African descent, you also have to consider that the white population is small. So it's about between 5 and 10% of Surinamese population, but Jews among those whites are very significant in percentage. Starting in the late 17th century, a third of the white population is Jewish. That's highly significant. And I challenge anyone to find a similar statistic anywhere in the Jewish world. The percentages like that are only achieved in modern Eastern Europe, where some villages have majority Jewish populations. But this is highly unusual. And in the early 1800s, 2/3 of the white population is Jewish. So in fact, after the emancipation of the Jewish community, after they lose all of their privileges in 1825 and are theoretically on legal parity with white Christians, Jews are the majority of the white population. And that helps to explain why they were eventually able to dominate in seats of political power, why there were so many Jewish parliamentarians, for example, by the 1860s.
So that's the end of the book, which you mentioned in the last chapter. You really discussed 1825, what happens then when they lose their autonomy. They're emancipated, so to speak, but they lose their autonomy, and what happens to the community after that, what that does to the community.
So emancipation in Jewish history is very important to understand in contrast to the emancipation of enslaved people. For enslaved people, emancipation means the release from slavery and the acquisition of liberty and legal parity, ostensibly, with whites. And of course, this legal parity is a very long battle to achieve, and in many ways is never achieved, arguably. By contrast, emancipation for Jews means a fall in status. For Jews in the Caribbean and parts of Western Europe, it means a fall in status. It means not only achieving legal parity, ostensibly with white Christians, but also a loss of privileges. So all those privileges that Jewish leaders so vigorously campaigned for a century and a half, that special status that gave them the right not to be served sentence on Sabbath and Jewish holidays, that gave them the right to have their own court and govern themselves by their own court, to have their own schools, to write their records in their own language, all of that goes away. And their high status also undergoes a collapse. This is in part not only because of the new legislation. So emancipation comes to Jews in 1825 in both Curaçao and Suriname, but it also happens because the majority population is undergoing emancipation. They are the majority of slave owners in Paramaribo by the early 1800s are in fact of African ancestry themselves. So the free population has direct experience with slavery, and because most of them are Christian, they start to occupy a status higher than that of free Jews, and that creates a huge amount of tensions and competition, if not outright violence, between white Jews and Christians of African ancestry who are now free and slave owners themselves. So when we speak about emancipation, especially in the Caribbean, we have to be sensitive to the fact that probably most Jews did not want to be emancipated. They were very nervous about it. Wealthy Jews were worried about losing their lofty privileges and their high status. And impoverished Jews were perhaps afraid of losing their direct access to Jewish charitable contributions, because that, of course, was a part of Jewish autonomy, the right to have these Jewish charities and to dole out charity to members of the Jewish community.
Okay, now that's really where the book ends, but I do just want to ask you, I'm sure listeners are curious, so what happened in the 19th century, 20th century until today? Well, the book it goes until the 19th century, really, mid-19th century, but what happens after that in the 20th century and then until today with the Jewish community?
The emancipation of Jews in 1825 gradually sets into motion an attrition of Jews from the colony. And this is actually parallel to a white attrition from the colony as well, as centers of opportunity open up to Jews and to Jews in Europe. Jews start to go abroad for their education and for their professional training. There was always a very strong stream of outmigration of white Christians, and as I mentioned before, it was very difficult to convince white Christians to come to Suriname in the first place. So there is a gradual draining of the white population, whether Jewish or Christian, out from the colony, and the Jewish community continues to dwindle. This, of course, is a territory that, I'm kind of walking on thin ground here, because most of my archival sources did not cover this time in the community's history. So it remains to be told by a historian of 19th century Surinamese history. But what I can say is that by the time of my arrival in Suriname for my on-site research, and that was in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the community was dwindling from 200 members to 150 members, and it was managing against great odds to exist. One of its synagogues was dismantled, as many of your listeners might know, and transported to the Jewish Museum in Israel, in Jerusalem, where you can visit it there, sand and all. And it was really a story of a dwindling population that had very tenuous attachments to the Jewish centers of Amsterdam, for example. When I was there, it was really difficult for the Jewish community to convince rabbinical students to come to Suriname and to educate the local Jewish population, and also to undergo circumcision. So a very interesting relationship with the metropole. There was an agreement between Amsterdam Jewish leadership and Surinamese Jews that Surinamese Jews could only allow a certain number of community members to be converted to Judaism, something like one male and one female. These were laws I didn't quite understand, but that speak very much to the post-colonial atmosphere of Suriname and the tenuous grasp of Paramaribo's Jews with Jewish centers in Europe. So this is a story that remains to be told by another historian. But also, as I always emphasize when I'm asked this question, it's not a story for me to tell. You really need to ask members of the Jewish community who continue to preserve the archives of Jews, the archives that are left behind in Paramaribo, and who continue to maintain the cemeteries and the synagogues, if not the community itself.
Okay. So for anyone interested in the book, I'll put a link in the show's notes below that anyone's interested can purchase the book. And also the other books as well that you mentioned on Suriname and the synagogues, the ones that you co-authored, I will try to link to those as well. And with that, thank you very much, Professor Bettmer, for joining me.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.